In the first 4 books of the Odyssey, before the introduction of the character of Odysseus himself, we see the state of affairs that Odysseus has left behind, and follow the struggles of Penelope and her son Telemachus in the absence of Odysseus, beset by suitors who are intent on marrying Penelope and murdering Telemachus, who has grown to the threshold of manhood in his father's absence, and who may soon pose an obstacle to their designs as he continues to mature. Telemachus is visited by the goddess Athena in disguise, and the goddess inspires Telemachus to equip a ship and depart secretly to search for news of his father's whereabouts, telling him, "Fit out a ship with 20 oars, the best in sight. Sail in quest of news of your long-lost father. Someone may tell you something, or you may catch a rumor straight from Zeus, rumor that carries news to men like nothing else. First, go down to Pylos. Question old King Nestor. Then cross over to Sparta, to red-haired Menelaus, of all the bronze-armored Achaeans, the last man back." And this is exactly what Telemachus does, sailing first to Pylos, or Pylos, located in the land of Mycenaean, beside the magnificent bay, located on the west side of the Peloponnese, beside the Ionian Sea. When Telemachus and his ship arrive, accompanied by Athena in the guise of Mentor, the Odyssey tells us that the people of Pylos lined the beaches, sacrificing sleek black bulls to Poseidon. They sat in 9 divisions, each 500 strong, and each division offered up 9 bulls. In the midst of it all, they found King Nestor himself, surrounded by his sons and his friends. It's an unforgettable scene. In the 1920s, when a Greek landowner in modern Pylos noticed some old stone blocks near the summit of a hill, the director of the Greek National Archaeological Museum called on his friend Professor Carl W. Blagan of the University of Cincinnati in the United States to lead an investigation. Professor Blagan had been a fellow at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens before World War I, and during that war he'd been involved in relief work in Macedonia and Bulgaria and had been recognized by the government of Greece after the war. During excavations over the next 27 years, interrupted by the Second World War, Professor Blagan and his team found that the stones were part of the best preserved Bronze Age palace on the Greek mainland, dating to the 13th century BC, a 2-story complex with dozens of rooms, halls, pillars, and even indoor plumbing. The team also unearthed a library of about 1,000 inscribed tablets containing writing in the ancient Mycenaean script known as Linear B, and among those tablets were clear references to their location as Pylos. So, Professor Blagan named the palace the Palace of Nestor, after the king of Pylos described in the Odyssey. In 2015, a team of archaeologists from the same University of Cincinnati, led by Sharon Stalker and Jack Davis, was conducting new excavations near the ruins of the Palace of Nestor. Together, they'd been working in the area for 25 years. Professor Davis, in fact, is the current Carl W. Blagan Professor of Greek Archaeology for the University of Cincinnati. In an olive grove, which had not even been their first choice of sites, but which they had settled on when their first choice was denied due to red tape, they and their team uncovered, in early 2015, an incredible new discovery, a previously undisturbed tomb located not far from the palace itself, between the palace and a nearby beehive or tholos tomb called Tholos IV, which had been looted in ancient times long before its modern rediscovery. They discovered a shaft grave. This shaft grave, discovered by Sharon Stocker and Jack Davis and their team, however, had apparently never before been found and had lain forgotten in these olive groves beside the ruins of the Palace of Nestor for the past 3,500 years. At the bottom of the grave were the remains of an adult warrior, a man judged to have been between the ages of 30 and 34 years old, and with him over 3,500 artifacts, including arms, armor, mirrors, combs, and jewelry of incredible beauty and artistic sophistication. They dubbed the find the Tomb of the Griffin Warrior, after one of the seals on the gold rings depicting a griffin. Many of the artifacts are believed to be of Minoan workmanship from the Minoan culture, which predated the Mycenaean civilization and which is thought to have come to an end due to the catastrophic eruption of the Te-ra volcano in 1600 BC. The grave of the Griffin warrior is thought to date to around 1500 BC. But as spectacular as the Griffin seal and the other artifacts uncovered in 2015 and the following years were, and are, one artifact from the ancient tomb remained hidden at first, a small stone only about 3.7 centimeters in length, encrusted in limestone deposits, which had been recovered from its resting place near the right arm of the grave's occupant. And after a painstaking process of removing the grime accumulated during that stone's 35 centuries in the ground, it was found to be an agate inscribed with an incredibly detailed battle scene, with a level of artistic and technical quality that astonished historians and archaeologists. Professor Davis notes that some of the details are only a half a millimeter in size, incomprehensibly small. In fact, in some later interviews, he's noted that some of them are even a tenth of a millimeter in size, about the width of a human hair. The level of craftsmanship is beyond what the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, even the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, had previously been thought capable of producing at that period of time. As Sharon Stocker is quoted as saying, "This seal should be included in all forthcoming history texts and should change the way that prehistoric art is viewed." End quote. Look at the detail of the artwork depicting the human figure in this carving. Look at the way the ribs are depicted on this figure, or the musculature of the back here. Remember that the entire stone on which this scene is carved is only 3.7 centimeters long, the entire stone, which is just 37 millimeters, or about 1.4 inches. Some have even wondered what kind of optics the ancient artist might have had in order to be able to create such a scene. What kind of artistic tools might have been used to carve such an exquisite level of detail into the hard surface of the agate. This seal stone was dubbed the Pylos Combat Agate, and it's truly one of the most remarkable finds in recent decades. It was only revealed to the public very recently, at the beginning of November 2017. And when I saw the images for the first time, I was astonished, not only for the reasons already remarked upon regarding the potential for this artifact to change our perception of art history, but within a few minutes of looking at the scene on the stone, I realized that the artwork in this scene incorporates celestial imagery using patterns which I've observed and written about before. It bases the figures in the scene on specific constellations, and it incorporates specific constellational references, employing artistic conventions found in other ancient artwork from other cultures around the globe. You see, for the past 9 years or so, I've been exploring the connections between the myths and the stars, and I have found more than enough evidence to conclude that virtually all of the world's ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories are built on a shared system of celestial metaphor. And what I observed in the artwork on this newly revealed Pylos Combat Agate fits patterns from other cultures and other centuries, as we'll see. The scene in the Pylos Combat Agate depicts a triumphant long-haired warrior in an extreme lunge posture, stabbing downwards into a foe with a sword held in his right hand, with his right arm raised over his own head. So this figure, I'll refer to him as the swordsman. The figure into whom the swordsman is plunging his sword has a very large shield, which appears to have been battered into a kind of a folded diamond shape, possibly from the prior combat. And this figure's right arm is extended straight back from his shoulder and is holding a long spear, the point of which can be seen on the other side of the swordsman, whom he's facing. Although his head is turned away, he's being stabbed right here. I'll refer to this second figure as the Spearman. He'll be tinted blue. He's evidently about to receive a mortal wound from the swordsman. Additionally, that Spearman wears a helmet with a prominent curving crest, and you can see that the left arm of the swordsman is extended towards this curve, and the left hand of the swordsman is grasping this curved crest of the spearman's helmet as the swordsman delivers that sword blow. And finally, there's a third figure stretched out below the two fighting figures of the swordsman and the spearman, and this figure has apparently already been killed, and his body is twisted into a contorted position, even though it's stretched out. And we'll refer to him as the fallen warrior. He'll be tinted green for identification purposes. And on the left, his head is to the left as we're looking at this seal. And his lower or left leg is fully extended to the right as we look at the scene. His right leg is sharply bent with the knee pointing upwards. And his body is twisted so that his back is facing us, the viewer. And the detail of the musculature of his back is extremely skillfully rendered by the ancient artist. His arms are splayed out at different angles, one drooping down towards his legs and the other bent over his head with the back of his hand against the ground. When I saw this scene, specific details immediately jumped out because I'd seen the same patterns in many other pieces of artwork down through the centuries and identified those details as indicating specific important constellations in the night sky. The details of this scene are strongly suggestive of the outlines of specific constellations and of constellations that form the basis of other pieces of artwork that we'll bring in as we discuss this. So let's examine these figures one by one. Beginning with the swordsman, we've already seen that his distinctive features include an exaggerated lunging body position. He's in an extended lunge with one leg far back, and he holds a sword in one hand, the hand of his upper arm, that arm being extended over his head, while his other arm reaches out and grasps the crescent-shaped crest on top of the helmet of the spearman. These characteristics identify the swordsman with a specific constellation in our night sky. One of the constellations in this very important region of the sky that we're looking at on the screen here. Now these are the outlines of those constellations, using the outlining system of author H.A. Ray, whose outlining system for the constellations, published in 1952, preserves the distinctive characteristics of the constellations which the ancient myths and ancient artwork associate with those same constellations. Can you spot a constellation which is in an exaggerated lunge with one leg far back and one arm up over its head, holding what appears to be a large sword in the hand of that arm? That is the constellation Hercules. This constellation is indeed associated with the figure of Hercules in myth, or Heracles, from the myths of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But this constellation is also associated with many other mythological figures in addition to playing the figure of Hercules or Heracles. And they're not copying the character of Hercules. These different characters in all the different myths are derived from this constellation, including Hercules. That just happens to be the name that we have for that constellation, but that does not mean that Heracles or Hercules was the first figure ever to be associated with that constellation. There are many figures associated with Hercules, the constellation, around the world. Here are a few examples of artwork from ancient Greece showing depictions of the mythological hero Heracles in that same exaggerated lunge posture. However, the same constellation also plays the role of Zeus, the most powerful of the Olympian gods. For example, here's an illustration of an ancient piece of pottery showing Zeus defeating Typhon, in which Zeus is depicted in the same deep lunge. The sword outline of the constellation Hercules can play the role of different weapons in different myths, although it's usually a very powerful weapon. Thus, it plays the role of the thunderbolt weapon in many mythologies around the world. It can also be envisioned as a tremendous mace, such as in the myths of ancient India, where the powerful hero Bhim carries a great mace, as does his half-brother, the god Hanuman. If the body posture of the swordsman, with his extended lunge, and the fact that his sword arm is up over his head in a manner characteristic of the constellation Hercules, are not enough for positive identification, there's another detail in the Pylos Combat Agate which confirms that the swordsman is patterned on the figure of the constellation Hercules in the night sky, and that is the fact that he is reaching out with his other arm and grasping the crescent-shaped crest of the helmet of his opponent, the spearman. If you look at the constellations near Hercules in the night sky, you can see that the beautiful crescent-shaped constellation known as Corona Borealis, or the Northern Crown, is just in front of Hercules, the constellation Hercules, and very close to the lower arm of that constellation. Although in standard depictions of the two constellations, Hercules and Corona Borealis are not connected, we can easily envision a line from the star at the elbow of the lower arm to the nearest star in the crown, so that we can envision the constellation Hercules holding the ark. There are many myths in which a figure associated with the constellation Hercules grasps a figure associated with the constellation Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown. For instance, in the story of the judgment of Solomon in the book of 1 Kings in the Hebrew Scripture, also commonly referred to as the Old Testament, two women come to King Solomon to resolve a dispute, and Solomon directs a swordsman to cut the living infant in half as a test to see which of the two women is really the mother of the child. I've already published extensive examinations of the evidence that shows that in this story, the swordsman in question is associated with the constellation Hercules, and the infant he is holding up in anticipation of the king's command is in fact the constellation Corona Borealis, the northern crown. While this seems like a rather unusual correlation or correspondence, you can see that in the artwork down through the centuries, the swordsman in the scene is usually depicted holding his sword in a manner similar to the constellation Hercules in the sky, and the infant is always arching vigorously to correspond to the shape of the northern crown. In fact, the two infants in that story of the Judgment of Solomon almost certainly correspond to the northern and southern crown, two different constellations, the northern crown and the southern crown, in the night sky for reasons that I discuss in my book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 3, Star Myths of the Bible. There are many other myths around the world in which a figure associated with Hercules snatches up an infant, such as in the myths of Maui in the cultures of the vast Pacific Ocean, in which Maui is cast into the sea foam by his parents and then rescued by his powerful grandfather and hung up in the rafters over the fire in order to dry out and warm up. I've also made videos discussing the passages in Revelation chapter 12 in which the Almighty snatches up the child which the dragon is waiting to devour, also based on the constellation Hercules snatching up the northern crown envisioned as an infant. In the Pylos Combat Agate, however, Corona Borealis is envisioned as the crest of a helmet rather than as an infant. But notice here in this much later Greek vase, dated to about 510 BC, or a full 1,000 years after the burial of the Griffin warrior at Pylos, a full millennium later, we see a Hercules figure grasping the plumed crest of a warrior identified as Syknos in a manner very reminiscent of the scene in the Pylos Combat Agate. The act of grasping the crest, then, should confirm that the swordsman in this artwork corresponds to the figure of Hercules, but the constellation of Hercules, not Hercules the character, the constellation in the sky. As if any additional confirmation is necessary, I believe the ancient artist has actually incorporated yet another specific detail in the form of the scabbard at the swordsman's hip, which projects out at a sharp angle and has a large globe-shaped knob at the end of it. The scabbard tip is positioned above the waist of the swordsman in the same location that the bright star Vega is located in the sky above the constellation Hercules. This detail confirms that we are dealing with a figure associated with the constellation Hercules as opposed to any other constellation that could be argued as being the basis for the outline of the swordsman in the scene of the Pylos Combat Agate. Moving on to the figure of the Spearman, some of his distinctive features include the fact that most of his body is covered by a large shield, with just his legs protruding at the bottom, and his helmeted head protruding at the top. He's also carrying a spear as his distinctive weapon, and he's located below the figure of the swordsman, who's depicted delivering a mortal blow to the spearman. Just beneath the constellation Hercules in the night sky is the towering figure of the constellation Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus is known as the serpent holder because there are two halves of what can be envisioned as a huge serpent on either side of the central body of the constellation. However, as I've demonstrated in extensive discussions in previous books, especially in Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, all about the Greek myths. Figures associated with Ophiuchus often carry a spear as their chosen weapon, or even two spears, because one or both of the serpent halves could also be interpreted as a spear rather than as a snake. Notice also that the legs of the actual constellation Ophiuchus are very short, as if protruding from beneath a large shield or long tunic, as if hidden by whatever this figure is imagined as wearing or carrying. Figures associated with this constellation also are often described in ancient myth as wearing a helmet, and the Pylos Combat Agate has only one figure wearing a helmet, and that is, in fact, the Spearman. The reason I believe that Ophiuchus figures often wear helmets is that the large head of the constellation, which is connected by lines here in the outline to form a triangle, could just as easily be envisioned as connected by curved lines to form a dome shape, suggesting a helmet. Another figure associated with the constellation Ophiuchus is the goddess Athena. I discussed the evidence for this association in my book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2. But notice that Athena is always characteristically described and depicted as wearing a helmet and carrying a spear. Another characteristic of Athena is the fact that she wears the aegis, which is often depicted as being fringed with snakes. In myth, this is because she places the head of Medusa on the aegis. Notice that in the Pylos Combat Agate, the Spearman is depicted with a fringe dangling down between his legs, somewhat reminiscent of depictions of the aegis. I believe this detail of Ophiuchus-based characters has to do with the fact that Ophiuchus is located immediately above Scorpio, and Scorpio often appears in myth as a serpent with multiple heads, or as some other monster with multiple heads. The multiple heads of the constellation Scorpio are just below the feet of Ophiuchus, which is why the fringed aegis, with its fringe of serpents, dangles down like the long garment of Ophiuchus, or at the edges, the fringes of that garment that Ophiuchus is wearing. These details should be sufficient to confirm the identification of the Spearman in the combat agate with the characteristics of Ophiuchus in the night sky. And additionally, while Ophiuchus figures are sometimes depicted as being descended from Hercules figures in myth, at other times Ophiuchus figures are described as being slain by Hercules figures, just as we see here in the Pylos Combat Agate. For instance, in the story of David and Goliath, I've examined abundant evidence that Goliath corresponds to the towering figure of Ophiuchus in the night sky. Note that the scriptures describe Goliath as wearing a helmet of brass upon his head, and also wearing a long coat of mail, and as carrying a mighty spear, all details which are characteristic of Ophiuchus figures in myth. After David strikes Goliath with a stone from his sling, and note that weapon being held over the head of Hercules could also be envisioned as a sling being whirled over the head of Hercules. After David strikes Goliath with a stone from his sling, then David goes over and takes the sword of the giant and cuts off the head of Goliath. The figure of the fallen warrior is a little more complicated because I believe the figure as depicted incorporates aspects of both the constellation Scorpio and the constellation Sagittarius. Scorpio and Sagittarius are both located below Ophiuchus and Hercules in the night sky for viewers in the northern hemisphere, and both often show up as sleeping, reclining, groveling, or even slain figures in other myths from around the world. Not always, but sometimes. For example, in the episode in which Artemis slays the unfortunate hunter Actaeon from the myths of ancient Greece, there's a beautiful bell crater which has survived from antiquity, in which the figures of Artemis and Actaeon are depicted in postures which I have identified as corresponding almost exactly to the outlines of the constellations Sagittarius and Scorpio, if we use the outlines of those constellations suggested by H.A. Ray in 1952. This is the name vase of the Pan painter from around 470 BC, which can be seen to this day in Boston's Museum of Fine Art. Actaeon, who's depicted being slain by Artemis and by his own hunting dogs, is clearly angled at the same angle as the constellation Scorpio in the night sky. And his upraised arm in the artwork gives his upper body a triangular or delta shape, just like the delta shape at the head end of the constellation Scorpio. The goddess Artemis can be seen to correspond to the constellation Sagittarius. The ancient artist has depicted her as angled at almost the exact angle as the outline of the constellation Sagittarius in the sky. She's depicted wearing a long dress reaching almost to her ankles, very similar to the outline of Sagittarius. She holds her bow at almost the exact same height as the bow of Sagittarius. The ancient artist has even depicted a plume or tassel on the end of her quiver, this quiver at her back, corresponding to the plume which rises up from the head of the constellation Sagittarius in the sky. So, we note that the Scorpio figure is being slain in this depiction. This is a clue regarding the identity of the fallen warrior in the Pylos Agate. Scorpio and Sagittarius each sometimes appear in myth as a figure which is either being slain or sleeping or something along those lines. The episode of Jacob's vision from the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament is illustrative of these aspects of Scorpio and Sagittarius. In that vision, Jacob lays down for the night and has a vision of a ladder or stairway stretching to heaven with angels ascending and descending on the ladder. I've presented analysis of this passage in Scripture, arguing that this ladder or stairway which Jacob sees in his vision corresponds to the Milky Way galaxy, which rises up between the constellations Scorpio and Sagittarius. And the angels, which are ascending and descending on the stair, correspond to the figures of the constellations Aquila and Cygnus, the eagle and the swan, which can be seen to be flying upwards for Aquila, the eagle, or downwards for Cygnus, the swan, within the Milky Way band. In Star Myths of the Bible, I argue that Jacob, in this episode, displays characteristics of both Scorpio and Sagittarius at different points in the story. Interestingly, artistic depictions down through the centuries sometimes portray Jacob in the position and outline of Scorpio and sometimes in the position and outline of Sagittarius. Here's an engraving from 1860 in which Jacob is angled in a manner suggestive of the outline of Scorpio. Note that the ladder reaching to heaven is on the left of the sleeping form of Jacob as we look at the image, just as the brightest and widest part of the Milky Way band rises up to the left, which is the east of Scorpio, as we look at the constellation from the point of view of an observer in the northern hemisphere looking towards the south. Note that the Almighty is depicted in this 1860 engraving, is depicted in the position of the constellation Hercules and in the posture of that constellation, bent forwards with one arm reaching downwards, just like the outline of the constellation. Instead of another arm overhead holding a sword, that part of the constellation is envisioned as a billowing robe arching over the head. In this different depiction of the same episode from Genesis, however, the sleeping form of Jacob is depicted with his head pointing in the other direction, to the left as we face the image, and on the other side of the rising ladder to heaven. Note that this time the artist has included features specific to the constellation Sagittarius. So he's in the position of Sagittarius relative to the ladder, the Milky Way, and he's in the posture of Sagittarius. One arm is flung over his head, corresponding to the plume of the constellation Sagittarius, which rises up from the head of the constellation, which could be envisioned as an arm flung over the head. And the outfit that Jacob is wearing in this painting looks like a long dress, rather similar to what is seen in the outline of the constellation itself. Note that the position of the arms of Jacob in this painting from 1665 are nearly identical to the positioning of the arms of the fallen warrior in the Pylos Combat Agate. On the other end of the stretched out figure of the fallen warrior, we see that one knee is thrust upwards, creating a wedge or delta shape evocative of the upper part of the outline of Scorpio. And for these reasons, I believe that the fallen warrior in the Pylos Combat Agate may have been conceived by the ancient artist as conjoining aspects of both Sagittarius and Scorpio. What could all this mean? The fact that one of the most sophisticated and astonishing pieces of artwork from the ancient world discovered thus far appears to be conceived as a scene connected to specific constellations in the night sky, and specifically to the constellations Hercules, Ophiuchus, and Sagittarius/Scorpio, certainly suggests that the connection to the heavens was extremely important to the ancients. In my examination of the connections between the myths and the stars, I've suggested that this ancient worldwide system used the point of the annual cycle between Sagittarius and Scorpio, where the sun is traveling when it is approaching the lowest point in the circle of the year, that winter solstice point, as indicative of a significant spiritual turning point, the point of second birth, the point where downward motion of the sun's path finally stops and turns back upwards. And that was first articulated by, to my knowledge, by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, and he talks about it in relationship to the winter solstice, but he didn't apparently know the connection to the specific constellations. So, building on his work, it stands to reason that if the constellations Scorpio and Sagittarius are associated with that point on the annual cycle, which they are, then they are also associated with that turning point, that critical turning point, which was given spiritual significance as being a point of reconnection to the spiritual realm. Similarly, movement up the Milky Way in some ancient myths appears to have to do to indicate raising the spirit, connection with the infinite realm, connection with the spirit realm, the realm of the gods. Just as in the vision of Jacob's ladder, Jacob sees a ladder corresponding to the Milky Way, connecting heaven and earth, and then realizes that, although he didn't perceive it previously, the presence of the divine was there with him in the wilderness. It's very possible that this exquisite stone represents even more than an incredible piece of ancient artwork, that it represented to the one who conceived it and the one who wore it connection with the realm of the infinite, the realm of the gods, the invisible realm that is present around us all the time, even though we don't always perceive it. There's overwhelming evidence that the ancient myths of the world use the realm of the stars as a way of representing and envisioning the invisible realm, conveying its truths in visible form and in story form, using the cycles of the heavens and the motions of the stars. And it is a fact that when we look into the heavens, we are indeed looking into the infinite. The ancient artist who created the scene on the stone that we call the Pylos Combat Agate seems to have been acutely aware of that connection. And the one who wore this stone, and indeed was buried with it, may have understood it as well. Now that this gem and its unbelievable artwork has come to light again after 35 centuries, 3.5 millennia, we can know it too.